Good evening. I'm Richard Avramanko, Professor of Political Science and Integrated Liberal Studies here at the UW-Madison. I'm also the Director of the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy, which is a think tank on campus that sponsors events just like this one. And this event is the final installment of a lecture series that we created this semester on conservative political thought. Over the past 13 weeks, we've read and discussed writings from Edmund Burke, French counter-revolutionaries, Mercy Otis Warren, Alexis de Tocqueville, Russell Kirk, Robert Nisbet, Michael Oakeshott, and Wendell Berry. We've studied conservative approaches to constitutional interpretation, feminism, the environment, and identity politics. And the students in this class, and including our nearly weekly guests that we get, thank you all for coming again, have had the proverbial grand tour of this strange world of conservatism. The outline of the course, including recordings of all of our guest speakers, as well as links to the readings, can be found on our website, which is csld.wisc.edu/conservative-political-thought. You might be able to just search it. I should also add that this is not only the last session of the semester for this class, but is also my final class at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. As many of you know, I will be moving to Arizona State University this summer, where I will be a professor and director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. But more importantly, our speaker today, Patrick Deneen, is the Curry Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. He holds a BA in English Literature and a PhD in Political Science from Rutgers University. From 1995 to 1997, he was speechwriter and special advisor to the Director of the United States Information Agency. From 1997 to 2005, he was Assistant Professor of Government at Princeton University. From 2005 to 2012, he was the Musaka Souvlaki Associate Professor of Government at Georgetown University. In 2012, he left the Jesuits in favor of the Holy Crossers at Notre Dame, where he still plies his trade. He was the founding editor of the online magazine Front Porch Republic, for which he continues to serve as a contributing editor. We heard from Professor Mark Mitchell, who is the president of the Front Porch Republic currently. Professor Deneen has written for publications such as First Things, The American Conservative, The New Atlantis, and Front Porch Republic. He's the author or editor of 8 scholarly books and many articles and reviews. He's delivered lectures around the world. His recent book, Why Liberalism Failed, was recommended by Obama and is, by all academic measures, a bestseller. His most recent book, about which we're going to hear some today, is called Regime Change. I'm delighted that Professor Deneen could find time to come and talk to us today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Deneen to Madison.
Thank you so much, Professor Avramanko, both for the invitation and the introduction, and I guess it would be remiss not to say just a word of admiration for Professor Avramanko. It is his last day here at the university, or last event at the University of Wisconsin. And as so many cases, I think people don't recognize what they've had until it's gone, and I think Wisconsin will be quite profoundly will experience your loss in ways that they can't yet anticipate. So I'm sorry for Wisconsin's loss. Congratulations to Arizona State's gain, and I look forward to seeing how things unfold in a little bit of a warmer and drier climate than this one. So I know I was introduced as talking about the recently published book, Regime Change, and I think since this is the last class meeting and last session of this, I thought I would rather than bore you with just a kind of summary of a book that I wrote, and I'm happy to talk about the book, and this talk relates to it. I thought I'd give you a kind of snapshot of where I see we are, in some ways where we are today, broadly speaking, in our politics, and which I think is maybe, I hope, provides something of a helpful both genealogy and roadmap of what the future may hold. And I'm doing this in the context of work I've been doing in recent years, picking up on a strand of thinking called post-liberalism, that is to say, what comes after the liberal order that I've been writing about, that I've written the obituary of in this book, Why Liberalism Failed. And often people will sort of punch back at me and say, well, isn't really the best option simply to try to preserve and defend this liberal tradition of which the United States is in many ways has been the exemplary nation. And I, with some reason and intention, I title this talk Post-Liberalisms, because what I want to talk about is, in many ways, the situation today. While many people are defending the liberal order, and the liberal order we might describe broadly as the order that places emphasis upon individual rights, upon aspects of governing in which the state claims a kind of neutrality, regarding what its purposes and ends are, or what the purposes and ends of human life should be, that it provides the kind of, almost the playground in which we as human beings can dig our own, dig our own sandboxes, make our own sandcastles, and as long as we don't interfere with the sandcastle building of other people. But in fact, it seems to me that in some very critical respects, we are in fact living in a kind of post-liberal time. There's lots of evidence to suggest that the high tide of liberalism has passed. And so it's less a kind of critique of liberalism and an effort to say, well, we just need to revive it. We just need to sort of defend it. And more just really kind of an empirical observation that across the board, liberalism as a kind of political agenda seems to have passed its peak, and really what we have on offer is a number of alternatives that it seems worth deliberating about. Why do I say it's past peak? Well, among other things, the project, you could say one of the key projects of liberalism was to make itself, in the words of one of its great proponents from the previous century, to make it into the universal and homogeneous state that it would become, and it had reason to think of itself as a universal political order, that everyone, regardless of where you came from, the tradition you came from, the religion you came from, the nation you were from, everyone could sign on because we could all see ourselves as members of this political system that said, you are this bearer of rights that doesn't rely upon any particular history or background or religion, and that therefore it's the only universal form of political rule, and therefore is the kind of logical end game. And kind of lying behind that were such things as the war in Iraq to sort of make possible the advance of liberalism in a part of the world that was decidedly not liberal. But also behind it as well was the kind of efforts of globalization, economic globalization, political globalization. And if nothing else, I think one thing we can conclude, whether it was COVID, that, among other things, had lots of unintended consequences. But one thing that is certainly we see happening is a kind of end of the high watermark of globalization. Right? The beginning, a kind of receding of those waters. One mark of that, certainly, not only like the issues about supply chains that we're well aware of, the increasing pressure in a lot of domestic spaces, good liberal countries, European countries, the United States pressure to defend borders and boundaries, to see those as necessitating a real forceful effort to define one's national sovereignty in terms of the borders and the walls and so forth. But of course, the invasion and the war that's taking place in, of course, various parts of the world, but particularly the war in Ukraine right now, breaks what was once seen as one of the kind of, you could say, the theorems that proved the logic and the inevitability of globalization. And this was Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist, his famous or maybe infamous theorem and principle, which was called sometimes dubbed the McDonald's doctrine, which held the view that if two countries had a McDonald's, they would never go to war with each other. This was the kind of McDonald's doctrine that proved to be true for about at least 30 years until Vladimir Putin's troops crossed the border and put not only not only started a war, but put the McDonald's doctrine in the dustbin of history, both of those countries having had a McDonald's. And in fact, McDonald's, among other things, closed the McDonald's in Moscow, which again is another sort of sign that globalization has come to an end. Broadly speaking, we've seen the passing of the height of the neoliberal moment. Neoliberalism as, again, this globalized view that democracy needed to be advanced, both in its kind of cultural form, in its political form, in its economic form, and if necessary, by force, that liberalism could be sort of transplanted by force in other parts of the world. And we see, of course, the rise of so-called populism as one further sign of the kind of the high watermark of liberalism. And these various features, I think, these various aspects of liberalism are, in significant part, what has created the conditions of the pushback by, broadly speaking, populism around the West, both in the United States, of course, in Britain, Brexit being, again, another signal moment in the receding of the waters of the kind of globalized liberal moment, and the election of Donald Trump. I'm also struck by the fact that the great herald of the triumph of liberalism, a man named Francis Fukuyama, whom I don't know if you've had to read for your class or had to talk about for your class, but famously wrote an article in 1989, an article that made him famous, made him one of the most talked about figures of that period of time, in which took the title, The End of History. The end of history had happened in 1989. And he wrote a very brief, about a 20-page article. It's very easy to read. I still assign it in classes. And he declared that the end of history had occurred because the question of history, of political history, had been settled. And political history was essentially the kind of battle over the question of what's the best form of political rule for human beings. Right? This grand question that had animated polities, empires have risen and fallen, kings, monarchs, aristocrats, oligarchs, they'd come and gone, all with the question, what's the best and appropriate form, political form, for human beings to live in? It's like the Fermat's sort of unsolved theorem in mathematics, that for a long time, political science, which claimed to be a science, couldn't answer the fundamental question underlying political science, which is what is the best political order for human beings? It's like 2 + 2 = we're not sure. And for thousands of years, we couldn't get that answer until finally Fukuyama declared, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the answer had finally come in. And the answer was that liberal democracy was the only regime, the only political form left standing after everything else had been tried, including, of course, fascism and communism. And those had fallen, and now we had a definitive answer. That book, that article, and then the book that arose, also called The End of History, by Fukuyama, was a kind of triumphalist declaration of this momentous moment of 1989 in which we had the answer. But in the last year, he published a new book called Liberalism and Its Discontents. And this book, far from being triumphalist, is an effort to defend liberalism from its critics on the left, especially those who critique the kind of neoliberal economics that has led to so much inequality in the world today, and its critiques from the right, especially from people like me, who critique it for its atomization, for the way that it kind of acts as a solvent upon sort of human communities and human solidarity, and throws us, kind of as Tocqueville describes, back into the solitude of our own hearts, that it destroys the kind of basis of civilization and human community. So we've gone from this triumphalist moment with Fukuyama to this kind of lament and effort to defend it against these very powerful critiques now coming from the left and the right, that he feels that liberalism is now beleaguered. So it turns out that the answer was more provisional than he imagined in 1989. So Fukuyama has gone from this, again, in 1989, from this triumphalist moment to a recognition that liberalism perhaps has indeed reached its high water mark. And here's the question: how would we date? What were the dates we would give to the triumph between the triumph of liberalism and the new need to defend it. And we might say that it spanned roughly 1989, if that was the high water mark, to 2001, which is when Fukuyama actually sort of said out loud, I might have been wrong. 9/11, 2001. I might have been wrong. Maybe it's not the end of history. Or we might date it to 2016 with the Brexit referendum passing and Donald Trump being elected. But this means somewhere between 12 and 27 years was how long the triumph of liberalism lasted. That's a very short span for a political order to sort of say, that's it. This is the moment of our triumph. It's a very short span, maybe a decade or a quarter of a century, and perhaps the following conclusion has to be drawn, that in its pure form, what in some ways Fukuyama was celebrating, in its pure form, liberalism is in fact a deeply unstable political order. It can't last very long in its pure form. It's like, I'm not good enough at science to know this, but there's certain kind of elements that can't exist for a long time without sort of bonding to other, you guys probably know this. Right? They can't exist in their pure form. They have to bond to something else. And in this case, pure liberalism, if we want to describe it that way, had a lifespan of somewhere just over a decade to about a quarter of a century. And maybe one conclusion to be drawn is that left unalloyed, left unconnected to some other tradition, even containing certain opposite features, it can't last for very long. Of course, this is an insight of Tocqueville in Democracy in America, for those of you who are fans like myself, Professor Avramenko, who observed that democracy in its pure form will undo itself. Right? It contains the qualities of its own self-destruction and recommends that democracy and liberalism has to in some ways retain certain features from the ancien regime in order to sort of maintain itself over a period of time. So I think we're actually in a time of post-liberalism. But it's not just one post-liberalism, it's several post-liberalisms. The very instability within liberalism today, I think, is manifesting itself in several post-liberalisms. And I want to talk about two in particular, and I think you'll recognize them pretty quickly. But let me begin with why liberalism is a kind of unstable system in and of itself. And I think there's no better figure who exemplifies this than the kind of philosophical titan of the liberal tradition, John Stuart Mill. And whether or not you've ever read John Stuart Mill and his great work on liberty, published in 1859, you know Mill's arguments because you probably have used them at some point in your life. Mill's argument, just to give you the very quick down and dirty, Mill's argument is that we should enjoy maximal freedom as individuals because only by having maximal freedom can we investigate, can we question, can we challenge, and overturn what turns out were wrong conclusions with better conclusions. And now if this sounds a little bit like what at least the theory of what a university is, you would not be wrong. This is one of the things that lies behind the idea of academic freedom. That academic freedom is that kind of context in which investigation of assumptions is undertaken. And why it's presumably a good idea to have a course on conservatism on a campus that's overwhelmingly liberal, because at least even if you're a liberal, you can kind of test your own assumptions. And Mill makes this argument in On Liberty. It's all about testing your own assumptions. And so that academic freedom, deriving from this argument by John Stuart Mill, is essential to discovering the truth. Right? That he argues throughout that the discovery of truth can't happen but in the atmosphere of freedom. But Mill had a further agenda that's connected to this, which is what's the source of the most errors, certainly at the time that he's writing. Most errors are held because people hold things by kind of habit. They hold views out of unquestioned assumptions. They just simply, that's how they were raised. It's what people have always thought. Yes, of course the world is flat. We've always known that. They don't investigate because they live in a society in which those views are held as a matter of kind of just assumptions of truth that don't undergo a kind of investigation. And so when Mill speaks of the great challenge that lies before what he calls a society that's the phrase he uses is it's infused with a spirit of liberty. The great obstacle to that is what he calls the despotism of custom. The despotism of custom. This is the worst form of despotism because it's the most insidious, right? If you have a despot out there who's oppressing you, you know who it is, and you know what he's doing. But if you're surrounded by these assumptions that you never investigate because it's the way it's always been, that's a despotism you can't even perceive. It's like the fish that swims in water and has no idea what water is. It's just the way things are. This is the despotism that has to be overturned in the name of especially progress. And it's progress that Mill argues over and over again will be the result of this atmosphere of freedom. It will lift the despotism of custom, overturn it, and a spirit of progress will follow, will flow from liberty. Now, what's the despotism of custom? Well, religion, tradition, kind of mores, traditional mores. He's writing in the Victorian era, right? Women, just all knew you had to wear skirts of a certain length so that your ankles didn't show. I'll try to avert my eyes here. He's a good Victorian. Right. He argued then that liberty wasn't just merely about the truth, but it was about opening up new possibilities, what he called experiments in living. That even as we would discover things were false that we had thought were true, we would open up new possibilities that we can't even imagine yet. This is, of course, the spirit of progress that would follow this atmosphere of liberty. And Mill says the more beliefs that will be put to the test, the more we will know which ones are valid and which ones are not. So we would go from the society that was highly tradition-bound, under the despotism of custom, to one in which a society would be suffused with experiments in living. It would be suffused with a spirit of progress, in which liberty would lead to completely new and unthought possibilities of human life. Now, if this starts to sound a little bit like the progressive world that we increasingly live in, like progressive campuses, well, that's for good reason. Because Mill anticipated a society in which the old forms, notice that most universities were founded in religious traditions. I teach at Notre Dame. It still has a religious tradition. And in the name of academic freedom, those religious traditions were all undone. And what took their place? A spirit not just of academic freedom initially, but increasingly a progressive worldview, in which experiments in living become the aim, to increase the possibility of experiments in living, to push back against all boundaries that prevent us from this experience of liberty. And Mill goes so far as to suggest the more truths that are overturned and the more truths that are discovered in the name of progress, the more we won't have to ask those questions anymore. So that the period of being open and questioning and academic freedom and challenging ideas is actually a kind of unstable middle moment, because it goes from one settled view to another settled view, in which the spirit of progress becomes the settled view. In other words, those who might prevent progress have now been put aside, and progress itself, experiments in living, becomes something of the aim. And indeed, Mill goes so far as to argue that because there will always be some differentiation in every society between those who are more progressive, more experimental, more adventurous, and those who tend to be more hidebound, more traditionalist, more backward-looking. Well, the people who are going to be more progressive, probably going to be fewer of them, they need to be kind of in charge. Because if you live in a democracy, well, the many unwashed masses, they could hold you back. And so Mill makes an argument, among other things, that faced with the possibility of being prevented from experiencing more progress in the name of experiments in living, you need to give those who are more progressed more votes. So they'll get more votes based on your level of education. He makes that equivalency. Now, where there's really vast differences, this is like maybe in England, you have progressive people, more educated people with more votes. So Professor Avramenko and I would have probably more votes than most of this room all put together. You guys might, one of these days, get your college degree, you'll get a few extra votes. Right? But if there's a really wide differential, such as, for example, between England and India, well, then voting, that's not going to do the trick. That's when you need, he says, despotism. You need despotism of the more advanced nation over the less advanced nation. Of course, he worked for the East India Trading Company, the kind of commercial arm of the British Empire, so he was a little bit self-interested. And he even made an argument that personal slavery might be necessary for a time, at least until backward peoples could be put into the path of progress. This is in a book called On Liberty. Mill's argument then leads to a kind of, you could say, a kind of argument in which the unsettled condition of open questioning and challenging is succeeded by a condition in which, now that we have achieved a condition of openness, experimentalism, that's always looking to push the boundaries ever further, there needs to be a kind of liberal paternalism. The paternalism of the more progressed over the backward, over those who are not sufficiently advanced yet. Thus, what many today, many who call themselves liberals, whether conservative liberals or old-fashioned liberals or classical liberals, what they yearn for is a return to that unstable time when there was open speech. Lots of campuses, I suspect perhaps even this one, I think I heard Professor Avramenko say he's involved with efforts to increase free speech on campus. Lots of conservatives today are invoking John Stuart Mill as their great hero because he's the one that will prevent us from being overwhelmed by all the progressives. But what they're longing for is a period that Mill himself predicted would be in the past, because more and more questions would be settled in favor of a progressive moment, of experiments in living. Now this, what I'm acknowledging, what I'm really trying to point to as an instability within liberalism itself, was recognized by a great political theorist that I think has influenced both Professor Avramenko and myself, and points to these kinds of post-liberalisms. And this is the political philosopher Leo Strauss, who wrote a really important seminal essay in the year 1964. It wasn't published. It was didn't write an essay. It was a lecture that he gave, which was published subsequently after his death. But the lecture was given in 1964, in which he described that modernity had taken place in three waves, three kinds of political waves. And that these three waves were inspired by various philosophers and influenced the ways in which people lived and understood themselves politically. And these three waves in some ways speak to the kind of contemporary post-liberal moment. Now, these three waves are read by many of the admirers and students of Strauss as three kinds of options that one can pick. You can be a kind of classical liberal if you take number one, you can be a kind of progressive if you take number two, or you can be a nihilist if you take number three. And these you can read these texts and decide which one are you going to be, which philosophy are you attracted to. But notice that Strauss made this argument in an essay called The Three Waves of Modernity. And he was not a dumb man. He was a very smart man. And he used this image of the waves quite intentionally. First of all, it's an invocation of a passage, a very important passage in Plato's Republic, where Plato talks about, or Socrates talks about, what's needed to create the best political order. And he talks about this as three waves, three steps that need to be taken that have to succeed each other. But Plato himself used this image of the waves for a particular reason. Of course, he lived in Greece, he lived around oceans. I realize I'm in Wisconsin, so this is going to go over all of your heads. But if you ever go to an ocean, maybe your lake here gets some waves sometimes, what you notice is that you love to spend time looking at the waves. It's just kind of mesmerizing and hypnotic. And part of the reason is that the waves constantly are coming in, they don't stop, and then they flow back, and the water from that wave enters, and in a sense makes the following wave. It creates its successor. It's impossible in some ways to tell where the old wave had gone away and the new wave takes its place. It's kind of if you ever watch like a little ball that's floating in the ocean, it keeps coming back in because the water isn't sort of just going away. It's contributing to the following wave. And this is the image that Strauss wants to use because the three waves are building, in a sense, on each other. Certainly the second and third waves are building on each other. Strauss, I think, then is recognizing something about especially the first wave of modernity, that it itself is helping to shape the subsequent waves of modernity in just the way that I'm describing that Mill does. Because Mill would be typically classified as a classical liberal, as a figure of modern natural right, as the kind of successor of the classical liberal tradition about free speech and individual rights. But notice the argument that I was highlighting also shows the way that his argument feeds into an argument about progress. That is to say, the end and purpose of historicism, that history moves forward and new developments take place and transformations occur in and through history. So these three waves, the first of these, classical liberalism, devised by Hobbes and Locke and the kind of classical liberal tradition, inspiring, among other things, our founding fathers. The second wave of modernity, a critique of the first wave, beginning with Rousseau and Hegel and Marx, argues that the view of human nature by these classical liberals is too cramped. Right? This is kind of what Mill is arguing. It's too cramped. It doesn't open possibilities of development and change and transformation and progress. It just sees us as kind of cramped, self-seeking, money-grubbing individuals, rather than potentially creatures that can be transformed and have a kind of different nature, almost, than certainly Hobbes and Locke assume. Marx argues that kind of at the end of history, as Marx imagines, we won't even have a sense of self anymore. All that time you spend thinking about me, that will be gone because the economic system will fundamentally change, and we will now only think about we. We won't have a sense of me. We'll only think of we. And so when Marx argues, well, there won't be any families, there won't be any countries, there won't be any religion, it starts to sound like a John Lennon song. It's not, from our perspective now, that sounds outrageous. How is that possible? No family? I love my family. How is that possible? Well, it's because we'll be different. We won't find it outrageous. It'll just be the way things are because we will have been transformed. And out of this second wave of modernity, because it turns out we can, in some ways, through history and through progress, shape ourselves, well, Strauss argues that this view is criticized by Nietzsche and by Heidegger as being not sufficiently recognizing the way that we ourselves can take over our own creation. We ourselves can make ourselves, but only the most courageous, only the bravest, only the most far-seeing will be self-makers. They will be, let's just call them Übermensch, for example. They will be the great people. And a lot of people will be too afraid to make themselves. They'll just be kind of, let's just call them the herd. Well, okay, Nietzsche calls them that. But out of each wave, its successor arises, is Strauss's argument. Today, I think what we are seeing, so when Strauss made this argument, he said each of these waves had corresponding regimes. That's really one of the interesting part of this argument. So the first wave of modernity historically gave rise to the liberal traditions within, especially the United States and Great Britain. So they inspired regimes, they inspired political orders. The second wave of modernity, progress, transformation, communism, right, inspires the Soviet Union, the revolutions throughout the world in the 20th century, China, Cuba, and so forth. And the third wave of modernity, inspired by Nietzsche, inspires fascism, of course exemplified in Nazi Germany. So Strauss, in this essay, concludes the essay by saying these three waves correspond to the great ideological battles of the 20th century. And he acknowledges, like Fukuyama, and Fukuyama was certainly a reader of this, that in 1964, one of these remained standing. But Strauss is very ambiguous at the end of this essay, saying that in some ways perhaps history hasn't ended, perhaps the waves haven't ended. And I think in many ways where we are today is no longer in a world in which you can say those three waves are sort of out there, that country has that wave, and that country has that wave, and that country has that wave. I think they're all here. They're right here. But increasingly, what we're seeing is the second and the third waves are succeeding the first wave in our midst. And if you're on the political, if you're a kind of old-fashioned liberal, you say, what happened? Where did our good liberalism go? It seems to have developed in some other direction, or some kind of invading force has changed it in transformed it. Where I began by talking about Mill as exemplifying this kind of instability, I think now helps us to see where we are right now. It helps to explain where we are right now. Where we are right now, in the first instance, is in a world in what was liberalism. For example, the college campuses was the center of at least a moment of liberalism, roughly from the beginnings of academic freedom, the beginnings of the disestablishment of religious institutions all across America. Formerly Protestant institutions all disestablished and became more or less centers of academic freedom. Well, that's roughly from the 1950s and 1960s, when it kind of reaches its high water mark, until yesterday, until 2 or 3 years ago, in which suddenly all these institutions, which used to be vehement about protecting academic freedom, started to say, well, we can't defend it against everything. There are certain views we can't have. There's certain backward views we can't permit on our campus. They create harm. They go against the mission of our institution. I heard Ben Shapiro was here, is that right? That was not sufficiently adequately canceled before he got here. That there are lots of views that can no longer be permitted, and this again I think is anticipated, and indeed you can find those conclusions in a number of Mill's arguments. But we don't have to look merely at Mill to see this. We can look at one of the figures who is widely regarded today as the architect of wokeism. The architect of wokeism, if you read some of the books, Christopher Rufo's latest book on the origins of woke, the Cultural Revolution, has a great deal to say about the figure of Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse was a figure associated with the Frankfurt School, so Marxism, kind of influenced by the Marxist tradition, but particularly what now we call cultural Marxist. No longer an emphasis upon the kind of old economic class analysis of Marx, but rather a Marxism that emphasized that the world could and was and should largely be defined as oppressed and oppressors. And those who were doing the oppressing needed to be overthrown and replaced by those who had been the oppressed. The categories of oppressor and oppressed remain for Marxism, but it's no longer class, or not merely class. It's also cultural. Who holds positions of power and influence in our society? Who are the elite in any given society? And today I think we can say we live very much in a kind of a world influenced by Marcuse's arguments, especially when one thinks of the way in which Marcuse's arguments is mapped onto various aspects of what we today call woke. Marcuse wrote an essay, a very influential essay, in 1965 called Repressive Toleration. Repressive Toleration. And this essay is essentially an argument, a kind of call to arms for why arguments for toleration, so the old Millian arguments for free speech, need to be overturned. And they need to be overturned kind of for the reasons that Mill himself anticipates and argues, which is that there's going to be a lot of bad people who are going to try to shroud themselves in claims of free speech and toleration, who themselves should not be tolerated because they're backwards. They're intolerant. They are not sufficiently progressed. His essay is a call to repress in the name of toleration, to limit speech in the name of toleration. Now, does anyone want to take a wild guess what thinker, what philosopher is quoted most often in this essay in an approving way? Anyone? Not Marx. I just read his lips. It's Mill. John Stuart Mill is the main source for this cultural Marxist argument. Right? So all the people now running around saying, what we need is more Mill, I'm saying kind of conservatives running around saying, we need more Mill to protect us against the woke. We need more free speech, campus free speech. Well, Mill is the source of the kind of the movement that led to the suppression of free speech, at least as far as Marcuse was concerned. So this is from the essay in 1965. This is just a kind of characteristic argument, claim that he makes. The active official tolerance granted to the right, this is the people who are backward-looking, conservative, traditionalists, as well as to the left. Okay, now you got to notice these pairs here. The right as well as the left. Here's the right. Movements of aggression as well as movements of peace. Right and left. To the party of hate, does that sound familiar? The party of hate as well as to the party of humanity. Right and left. I call this tolerance abstract or pure inasmuch as it refrains from taking sides. But in doing so, not in taking sides and not taking sides, it actually protects already established machinery of discrimination. Right? So tolerance is just protecting people who shouldn't be tolerated, who need to be repressed. Right? And who does he invoke now? This is from the 1968 postscript. In any case, well, actually, let me, I left a slide out, but yeah, this is from the before we get here. Mill, he quotes Mill in the body of the text, in which he states that Mill writes that intolerance has heretofore delayed progress. Liberating tolerance, then, would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. And there, in that very moment, he quotes John Stuart Mill's argument for the need to suppress those who are traditionalist in their viewpoint, because they are preventing progress. They're preventing the movement of progress. Here in the 1968 postscript, as you might expect, Marcuse favorably quotes Mill's passage in which he talks about the need for numerical superiority of those who are more progressed, the kind of electoral superiority. So in any case, John Stuart Mill, he writes, not exactly an enemy of liberal and representative government, was not so allergic to the political leadership of the intelligentsia as the contemporary guardians of semi-democracy are. In other words, he wanted the bright, progressive people to be in charge. People, well, like let's say at universities today. And here he quotes from Mill. These are two quotes from Mill's thoughts on representative government. Right? Until there's been devised and until opinion is willing to accept some mode of plural voting which may assign to education as such the degree of superior influence due to it, blah, blah, blah. Universal suffrage cannot be obtained without bringing with them the more than equivalent evils. So the justification for having more votes attached to people who are more progressive. Now, I emphasize this again to suggest and to point to the way that pure liberalism contains, in a way, its own kind of contradictory element. And it's right there in Mill. And Marcuse sees it, and he drives the Mack truck right through it, proverbially. Which is to say, he says, Mill, you read right in Mill the justification for why it is that a kind of more progressive or historicist, what Leo Strauss will call a progressive or historicist understanding, needs to succeed this classical liberal understanding. So Mill is simultaneously invoked by classical liberals, but he's also invoked here by Marcuse, and with good reason, that he himself was seeing the kind of trajectory. Well, how then, or in what way then do we see a kind of third wave of modernity? And I think it's in our midst. Indeed, I'm told it's actually in your class, which is a kind of renewed and a new form of Nietzscheanism. embodied in none other than, yes, the Bronze Age man himself. Bronze Ager. Right. If it's to be believed, Bronze Age pervert is actually Costin Alamariu, holds a PhD in political philosophy, like some of us here, from Yale University. Unlike some of us here, he's actually a member of the elite. His Costin Alamariu wrote his doctorate essentially on eugenics in the history of political thought, and published it recently, his dissertation recently, as a book called Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, published in 2023, and it debuted as #1 on Amazon, not in a category like political philosophy, #1 of all books. Still appears regularly in the top hundreds of books, so it's being bought, if not read. This is his, if he's the same person or not, the Bronze Age pervert has 150+ followers on Twitter or X, quite influential, especially among younger people. And these are especially young men who bridle under the influence of the second wave of modernity and its fruits. And rather, in many cases, than saying we can go back to liberalism, their view is that we need to go forward to the next wave, in a sense, forward to the claim that we fight against this oppressive egalitarianism of the woke left by an invocation of Nietzsche and Nietzsche's kind of epigones, an invocation of human greatness, especially masculine greatness. This is, of course, at a deep level, we would say, like John Stuart Mill, it seems to be a kind of contradiction of liberalism. Right? To say that you should oppress and not tolerate certain people seems to be contradictory to liberalism. And yet, as I'm saying, this is a kind of wave that flows out of liberalism. Well, in its own way, Nietzscheanism is also a wave that flows out of liberalism. Now, it certainly is not liberal. It's deeply illiberal in its kind of deep anti-egalitarianism, not even recognizing the inherent dignity of human beings. It's sometimes sotto voce, but often quite ardent and strongly expressed racism. It's misogyny. It's endorsement of natural hierarchy. I probably don't have to, those of you seem to be familiar with this, a few of you at least. But what I really want to emphasize is the ways that, especially in response to the rise of the second wave in our midst, it is, in fact, an invocation of a very familiar form of liberalism in the name of liberty, in the name of human freedom, a kind of extreme articulation and a panegyric to freedom from debased opinion, the freedom from mediocrity. This is also, by the way, an element within Mill's own writing as well. Mill has these kinds of Nietzschean moments in his own writing, the fear of being oppressed by the debased opinion of the many. Right? He's not averse to these kind of Nietzschean moments as well, the mediocrity of the demos. What appeals, especially in Bronze Age pervert, to especially young men on college campuses today and beyond, is its radical call to human greatness, individuality, a kind of reclaiming of the old practice of meritocracy. You'll often hear that the DEI apparatus needs to be dismantled and reinstitute forms of meritocracy, everything from the SAT to the recognition of human excellence, natural human excellence that occurs simply as a result of birth, that superior humans should rise to the top. Indeed, in this sense, it maps onto certain elements of liberalism, of classical liberalism, right? Which of course celebrates human inequality. Now, it doesn't celebrate natural, or actually, let me take that back for a second. It doesn't argue that human beings are unequal in some fundamental, abstract way that allows us to be considered to be equal under law, equal in voting, except when you read John Stuart Mill, equal in certain important respects politically. But it celebrates natural inequality, especially as in economic matters, right? Where our natural abilities it is an intended result of classical liberalism. in the form of capitalism, that those with distinct abilities and talents should emerge as the best, should emerge as the winners, should emerge as people who are superior economically to others. This connection and understanding of the linking, especially of Nietzsche and individuality, right, this key feature of classical liberalism, has been noted for a long time in the literature about Nietzsche. Most recently, a book by a political theorist named Stephen Pitts is called Nietzsche, Individuality and Spiritual Freedom, kind of celebration of individuality and spiritual freedom. Again, a kind of call to that aspect of the classical liberal tradition. And especially in response to the second wave of modernity that, as we've seen, is a kind of, has a way of suppressing the distinctiveness of individuals under its call, its movement toward a kind of broad egalitarianism in its cultural Marxist form. The successive wave emphasizes especially the central need of human greatness and individuality. Now, one example of this, and I hate to invoke Twitter after having invoked Leo Strauss and Nietzsche, but this fellow here, if you follow, or I'm not recommending to follow him, but this is somebody who self-identifies as a kind of Nietzschean liberal. And he has a huge following, 150 plus followers. And he says quite frankly, he considers himself to be a Nietzschean liberal. Some lives are more valuable than others. Democratic capitalism has proved, right, the classical liberal economic system has proven to be the best system for achieving human greatness. And he wrote about this on his Substack, which I took a photo of the five elements of Nietzschean beliefs. So humans not only are above animals, but some humans are above other humans, number one. Two, society disproportionately benefits from scientific and artistic genius, very Nietzschean kind of point. Three, hereditary is the dominant force behind human variation, something you'll see a lot in this kind of subworld of X and Twitter, but it's not as subworld as one might think today. Egalitarian ideology and concerns over social justice are primarily driven by ugly instincts. This is Nietzsche's critique of ressentiment, the resentment of the kind of Christian ethos that drags down the great in the name of the oppressed. And then while rational beings must be utilitarians to some degree, non-utilitarian commitments are the best: beauty, freedom, progress, and so on. Again, we might agree with these things, but these were emphasized very much by Nietzsche as the products of only a society that could produce and protect great individuals from the leveling force of the many. So to conclude then, we find ourselves today in many ways in this world that Strauss himself described as having been the three great ideologies that contested in the 20th century, except they're no longer out there. They're right here. They define increasingly our politics. And what once went by the name of left and right in our country, liberals and conservatives, or Democrats and Republicans, would be almost unrecognizable to liberals and conservatives, or the left and the right, 20, 30, 50 years ago. Because at that time, you had largely a disagreement between left liberals and right liberals. Right liberals being the kind of Reagan conservatives, and left liberals being the kind of, the remnant of the Joe Biden kind of generation. Or he is the remnant of the Joe Biden generation. Left liberals, right? Not woke, per se. But notice what we have today is whatever remnants of those parts of the liberal tradition that remain part of the main two parties in our politics are increasingly either altogether almost complete subsidiarities, right, of its further left movement, the subsequent development in the movement of history, and in the case of left liberalism, almost entirely taken over by wokeness. And you just have to walk a few blocks on campus here to see it. Blocks, just walk down the street here to see it, that the left today is almost entirely taken over. This one of the reasons why Joe Biden was both the nominee and was elected is that he is the last gasp of an old liberalism, and the successors in the Democratic Party reflect this fundamental change. So a kind of growing alliance with the post-liberalisms. On the left, it's already more or less accomplished. But on the right as well, one sees not a kind of objection to, but an increasing embrace of right Nietzscheans by the classical liberal right. A kind of willingness to say, you know, we can go with you guys down the road a certain distance. We talk the same language. We care about the same things. You like meritocracy, we like meritocracy. You like democratic capitalism, we like democratic capitalism. You like the inequality that results from that, we do too. You know, maybe we're not going to buy every aspect. We still believe the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, but we just won't talk about certain things. That's how political alliances are shaped and formed. And more on the right, this kind of fairly, sometimes ugly form of Nietzscheanism has been kind of repackaged, and it's being embraced on the right. I note, for example, that the journal First Things, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, traditional Jewish journal, created in the 1980s, maybe a little earlier, to kind of form what would become the kind of the Christian, or I should say sort of conservative orthodox view of things that would influence the Republican Party, for the first time about a year ago published an essay which quite clearly was drawn and influenced from the writings of Bronze Age Pervert, about the Longhouse, about being ruled and governed by the gynocracy. And a critique of the Longhouse, which is one of the phrases from Bronze Age Pervert. When that essay appeared in First Things, that to me was sort of, okay, this kind of marriage now between this old right and the Nietzschean right is being consummated. The Andrew Tates and the move of the Claremont Institute to embrace these ideas, a kind of libertarian anti-woke movement, all of these are indicators of this growing alliance, seeing itself as needing to oppose itself to those, to that second wave. Now let me just conclude by pointing out that when one hears critiques of these, so for example, when people on the right critique wokeness, you will hear it most often critiqued as this foreign thing. The number of times I hear it criticized, it's just communism. It's just communism again. It's cultural Marxism. It's just the return of this old thing that we thought we defeated in the Cold War. Just remember that its architect was drawing most heavily from John Stuart Mill. It's not foreign. It's not foreign to the liberal tradition. It comes right out of it. It comes right out of the instabilities within the liberal tradition. Just as the response, the kind of, softish Nietzschean response, comes out of and aligns itself with a different part of the liberal tradition. So I just conclude by saying that we are in many ways in a post-liberal moment, and I think it's more than a moment. I think it's likely to continue for some time. And that's why, for those of you who read my most recent book, I think if we're going to have an alternative, it has to be a post-liberalism that gets us out of these waves, that ceases tumbling us in its midst, and perhaps tries to construct a post-liberalism that will chart forward a way in which we are neither merely progressive beings nor Nietzschean beings, but human beings. Thank you so much for that. I'll get that off of there.
So we have Q&A now. We don't have a hand microphone, so if you could...
Oh, I'll repeat the question, sure.
Deneen will repeat your question.
I'll go.
Sure.
Thank you so much for this presentation.
You're welcome.
This is great. So you talked about Leo Strauss, and obviously he talks about the theological, political problem, and this idea of return. And so my question is to what degree, you talked about this posture towards universalism as a key project of liberalism, to what degree is that an inheritance or a theological inheritance of Judaism and Christianity?
So I'll repeat the question, which I hope I'm not garbling it, but the question is how and to what extent is, broadly speaking, the kind of liberal tradition a kind of...
Maybe this infatuation with this notion of progress.
Yes, how much does it kind of arise from the liberal, from the Christian tradition, from the theological tradition, right? So are you the... Schmidt student? Okay, I was told about somebody who studied Carl Schmitt. No, you're the Schmitt. You're the Schmitt person. Because I mean, I've been teaching a little bit of Schmitt, and Schmitt, I think, with Strauss, emphasizes the way in which, as Schmitt himself will put it, how politics is always, in a sense, theological. And I absolutely agree with that. And I think much of what we're seeing in what I'm describing in the three waves of modernity, you could say all three of them reflect kind of distortions of or incomplete embrace of, broadly speaking, Christianity. Right? Since I have a whiteboard here, I'll subject you to this. Let's see if this works. So the way in which I sort of typically think about this is that in the classical tradition, so ancient Greece, and so if you read Aristotle, Plato, or in the Christian tradition, especially I think the Catholic Christian tradition, especially as Aristotle influences Thomas Aquinas, and this kind of gets pulled into the tradition as a whole, there's an understanding of human beings as these kind of mixed creatures. Right? And I think there's no line that better exemplifies this in Aristotle when he says that man, the human being that has to live in a city, the creature that has to live in a city, in a polis, in a political community, is neither a beast or a god. The creature that can live outside of the city is either a beast or a god. Right? So that the human being is neither of these two things, but I think Aristotle, and I think broadly the Christian tradition recognizes, let's see if this works, broadly recognizes that we in some ways have kind of qualities of both. Right? So if I could picture this as a Venn diagram with sort of these overlapping circles and say that the middle circle, here's the human being, here's the sort of perfect existence of the gods. Right? The gods who, if Notre Dame might have a crucifix on the wall, but the ability to be completely self-emptying. Right? The God as a creature of perfect virtue and perfect love, especially as a Christian God, and the beast as a creature of desires and hungers and instincts, right? And it almost, you could say that in the Platonic understanding, this Venn diagram you could say it kind of mirrors the human body. I want to put it that way. The higher things, we sort of think that's the nobler part of the human beings, and without being too explicit, the lower things, like we start with the belly and move down. This is where the appetites are. This is when Plato uses the image of the body as also exemplifying the city, he's thinking about it in these terms, where the high should govern the low. And this is the classical Greek understanding. That dimension of our existence, reason, right, especially in the Greek understanding, or in the Christian understanding, love, combined with reason in the Thomistic understanding, that should govern. And this is why Aristotle argues that a good polity, a good political order, should seek to shape us to approximate as much as possible the virtuous human being, right? To attain a condition of perfect virtue. He says the person who's perfectly virtuous leads a life like the gods, he says. Not the typical Greek gods, but his kind of conception of the divine. So in the best political order, the human being becomes godlike. And so he describes politics as potentially a kind of ascent to excellence. And you find this throughout the classical Greek and Christian tradition. But the classical Greek and Christian tradition also emphasizes that you cannot eliminate the bestial part of ourselves. It's ineliminable. In the Christian tradition, certainly, original sin can't be overcome. Right? Even the saints are stained by original sin. Right? So, as far as I know, at least in my tradition, Virgin Mary is the only human being born without sin. I guess Jesus too, but human who's not also God. That we are creatures that cannot get rid of, cannot eliminate the low part of our nature. And so classical philosophy and Christian philosophy is always, how do you shape a political order that sort of creates the conditions for the development of our excellence, virtue, but not to the extent that we think we can overcome or eliminate this low part of our nature. So, to get back to your really good question, the first wave of modernity, do you remember that? Go all the way back here. The first wave of modernity, Hobbes, Locke, Machiavelli, they argue, well, we've been spending a lot of time over these thousands of years trying to get human beings to be better. And that's been a big waste of time. Right? Famous line in chapter 15 of Machiavelli's The Prince. Right? Past philosophers have spent a lot of time creating imaginary republics that have never been seen. I want to do something useful, and so I will take men as they are and not as they ought to be. It's right from chapter 15 of The Prince. What is he saying? I'm going to put a line, sorry about this, I'm going to put a line right through this Venn diagram, see if it's any better, not really, and say, this is what we are. This is what human beings are. Not this. Forget about this. Maybe heaven. But this is what we are. And this is the classical liberal tradition. This is the tradition of the founders of the United States, right? Right there in Federalist Papers. Men are not angels. Right? If men were angels, there would be no need of government. Madison, right? Name the guy who's the city's named for. He says, if men were angels, there would be no need of government. Now, as a Catholic, that's a pretty heretical statement, I have to say, because God has a government. Like, there are angels, there's hierarchies. But he was a Protestant, he was a Presbyterian. Why? Because Presbyterians, and especially Presbyterians, they emphasize our fallenness. And out of human fallenness, nothing good ever came. All you can pray for is grace. So the founders of this country were heavily influenced by this first wave of modernity. That you should not look to politics to make us better. You should look to politics to control our bestial side. And maybe even create kind of mechanisms where we can harness the bestial side and make it productive, which is also a line in Machiavelli, right? Create dikes and dams and sluices so that you take those waters that you can't control falling down and make them productive, make them turn mills. Well, what's capitalism? What's the theory of capitalism? What's the theory of our Constitution but that? Take these destructive energies of self-interest and make them, harness them and make them productive. Don't try to appeal, right? Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith. Don't appeal to my benevolence. Appeal to my interest. Well, the second wave of modernity looks at this line and they say, this is horrible. This is a complete insult to what I think human beings really are. I think human beings are much better than this. And who of us hasn't been sort of, maybe if you're really an Ayn Randian, you buy this. But most human beings sort of say, we're not just that, we're actually better than that. Well, some, like Rousseau and Marx said, we're a lot better than this. In fact, they get this all wrong. There is a line, but it's here. This is what we really are. That's what we really are. We're perfectible. And we're perfectible, we're not perfect now, but history and the movement of history will lead to our perfection. Right? We'll create the conditions in which we will become perfect. We will be like gods. And indeed, a lot of the literature from this period, from the kind of progressive era, whether the 19th or the 20th century, is about making us into gods. Right? The religion of humanity. Phrase oft repeated both on European and American political thought. So this is the contestation between the first two waves, which when I was growing up, that was the contestation. The United States against the Soviet Union. I was still around then. But this is where the third wave of modernity comes in, which is to say, Nietzsche looks at this and he said, this is all wrong. Right? Because human beings are not going to become gods. Not all of them. Some of them might. Most human beings are kind of down here. Right? So what Nietzsche proposes is this. There are no human beings. There's the Übermensch, and there's the herd. That's what the third wave is. So what am I here proposing tonight? So it's all political theology all the way down. And that's why, given a choice between these, and I'm not sure if there's another choice, if there's another chapter, and there might be, but my choice is how do we have a post-liberalism that appeals to this pre-modern understanding of the human being as a full human being. So, sorry, I went on long there. But yes, Professor.
Far be it from me to defend liberalism.
Yes.
But I'm going to give it a shot. Okay. A couple times he slid back and forth language of liberalism and democracy. Mm-hmm. So they're sometimes interchangeable for you, but I'll forgive that. But the language that you most often use is the language of progressivism. And we'll come back to theology and bad theology here. The problem seems to me that you're describing is not liberalism, but liberal progressivism. And progressivism is something, as I often describe, as an error in temporality. It is a mistake in time consciousness. so this is maybe a little bit of the Vogelin coming out of me here, that progressivism as a political doctrine is merely an immanentization of the Christian eschaton. So it's an error. And if that is so, which I think it is, could we imagine a kind of liberalism that is not progressive? It doesn't make this kind of error? Like, so you invoke Machiavelli here, or even Nietzsche. Remember, Nietzsche and Zarathustra has a gateway called This Moment, when Zarathustra has to choose. I think he's got the dwarf on his shoulder at the time, which is Jesus, and he has to go through the gate. He has to choose the straight pathway, which is linear time, or the cyclical one, and he chooses the cyclical one, or the eternal recurrence. So what Nietzsche's trying to do is to say, look, the categories that we've been given from Christianity, this is the idea of linear time that begins in one, comes to an end, and punct at the eschaton, right? That we need to get rid of that, and if we can then create a kind of liberalism that is not predicated or based on this concept of progress, or a movement of time from a beginning of chaos to a perfect cosmos at the end of time, then we can have a kind of liberalism that is not just good, but it's not based on error. So is there a kind of liberalism that you might suppose or suggest that could be something like not liberal progressivism, but liberal cyclicalism, or some other kind of temporality that would inform liberalism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's hard to summarize that great question, but the core of the question is there a way, am I not ascribing in my talk to liberalism as having a kind of understanding of time that adopts a view of time that liberalism itself does not have to endorse or embrace. In other words, that it can be, in other words, it does not have to have this perfectionist or progressive understanding. And I hope it was clear in the talk, and if not, I apologize for that, that I think it's actually quite the case that classical liberalism is precisely what you're describing, that classical liberalism has a view of human time in which time passes, but there's no sort of moral meaning ascribed to time. That might be something that you're describing, that it's not, that the past is not inherently assumed to be worse than the present. Right? And indeed, I think this is the heart of the idea in the idea of the state of nature theory, which is that you can see and know and understand human nature by the device of the state of nature, which takes us out of time, which in a sense takes human beings out of any time and out of place, conceptually takes human beings out of any time and place, and says, if we take human beings out of all times and places, so let's just say here we are in this room and we know we're sitting in this law school at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in the year is 2024, blah, 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 we would know a lot of accidental stuff about ourselves. But if we want to know what's true about ourselves, we take ourselves out of time, conceptually. This is, of course, what John Rawls does in his Veil of Ignorance, and what Locke and Hobbes do in The State of Nature. And only by doing that can we know and understand what human nature is. So in this sense, temporality is deceptive in a way. And so I think in classical liberalism, there's an understanding that one doesn't have to make an assumption about one's time and how it defines one. So it's quite the case that the second wave of modernity, right, develops out of this view and develops the view that temporality is, in a sense, is more important than our nature. Or to put it another way, our nature arises out of temporality. We are, in fact, creatures not with a nature, a given nature that you can go at any time and go back and look conceptually and see what that is. Rather, your nature is always a result of where and when you are, and in Mill's case, where you are on the temporal map. England's going to be more advanced than India in this case, in his view. So your question is excellent, because the question is, it says, isn't one of these more truly liberal than the other? And my answer to you is no. They both claim to be liberal. Right? Certainly Mill claims to be a liberal, and we would assign Mill with the label liberal. And yet he has all the features of a progressive. Right? Classical liberals tend not to notice or tend not to want to talk about that aspect of Mill, but it's there. And also the classical part of him is there. In other words, he's that wave that's just going back to form the other wave. He's very much that kind of figure who is kind of transitional between the classical and the progressive. So my response to you, and this is a source of a lot of debate that I've been having over the years, is that progressive liberalism is not a betrayal of liberalism so much as a kind of development from within liberalism. Now, of course, that's not to say that you can't have a liberalism that is, in your form, pure and pristine, but my point tonight, which I'm willing to go to the wrestling mat, although I think I'd lose to you, is that I think pure liberalism is fundamentally unstable. I think it's unstable because it actually, in itself, inherently gives rise to the condition and belief of progress. Now, that idea and condition and belief of progress might be primarily in an economic form, but it's hard to restrain it to the economic world because, as we know, the economic world starts to do things like, well, it starts to make claims about changing our humanity. Right? We're living through that right now. AI, right? Consciousness-enhancing drugs, the kind of expanded consciousness that comes of people who travel, who are no longer trapped in a particular place. In other words, an economy that accompanies classical liberalism gives rise to a belief in certainly economic and material progress that's hard to keep contained within that doesn't bleed out into ultimately the belief in human transformation. And I'll make one last point, and I think you want to come back at me, but those who are most classically liberal in their viewpoint often, not always, but often also tend to be transhumanists. The most libertarian thinkers in the world today tend to be transhumanists because they believe that true liberty will allow us to develop and to apply the scientific developments that will allow us to change our nature. So it's just on the back end that we're going to see this transformation of human beings. And it's not history necessarily, it's going to be technological. But kind of they end at the same point. So the progressive nature of the second wave actually kind of touches in a different way is advanced by the most classical of the classical liberals today. Did you want to?
We'll go back in time.
Okay, well,
at the supper club.
okay, excellent, okay. Should we take one more? I know we're probably, if there is one, yeah.
Hermeneutics.
Student? Yes.
Just wondering if you could re-explain. So John Stuart Mill had the idea that we have this despotism of customs and that progress would change or fix that. So was he a proponent of that, or was this just an observation, or was it a warning?
Yeah. So I gave you the really short, down and dirty. So the question is about John Stuart Mill's view toward the despotism of custom. He was in favor of despotism, but he was not in favor of the despotism of custom. He wanted to overturn the despotism of custom primarily through the mechanism of freedom. So what Mill, where he begins on liberty, and this is really important development within liberalism that I think also in its own way addresses Professor Avramenko's question. You could say classical liberalism, maybe the liberalism that Professor Avramenko would prefer for us to stay, is really a kind of claim about human freedom needing a kind of a container and protection of the liberal order, and that the liberal order allows for the space where we can pursue our own conception of the good, where we can pursue, whether it's you want to be a hobbyist or you want to be a, Olympic skier or nuclear scientist, you can pursue your own conception of the good and worship as you wish. So all of those kinds of classical liberal rights and entitlements are a part of that. It's all premised on the idea that we are sovereign choosers. Right? So it's premised on the idea, going back to the state of nature, that our nature, in the state of nature, what's our essence? Our essence is that we have free choice, complete free choice. In fact, maybe too much free choice, because my free choice and your free choice might come into, might clash, and then we're going to need a referee to come in. And that's the role of the liberal state, to say, okay, break it up, enough clashing there. You can pursue your good up to this point. So classical liberalism then makes a claim that you can have a lot of different ways of life. And those ways of life can then be in the form of religious beliefs and traditional societies and various cultures, and the state will sort of stay indifferent to that. But notice there's a kind of, again, there's an instability here, which is, what if you grow up in a traditional society? And there's a big question of how sovereign a chooser you are. Are you actually able to make a free choice if you're brought up as a member of the Old Order Amish? The Old Order Amish, they send their young people out into the world your age, 20, late teens, 20s, go sow your wild oats, go do crazy things youth do. For 2 years, live among the English, they say, and then when you come back, you make a choice. Will you remain a member of our community for the rest of your life and swear fealty to the Old Order Amish, or will you go out and live among the English for the rest of your life? And like 90% go back into the community from which they came. They have fun for a couple of years. There's a whole movie about this called Roomspring. I don't recommend it. It's not wholesome, but you get a sense. It's just basically a frat movie, but with Amish people. And Roomspring literally means to run around. This is the tradition, to go run around for a year or two, and then to make this momentous decision. Now, when this movie and a book of this title came out, this was kind of being discussed. I was at Princeton at the time with a lot of Lockean, Rawlsians, and we were discussing this and the fact that 90% of Old Order Amish went back into their communities after these year or two. And one of my former colleagues, a good Rawlsian, Lockean, was outraged at this. And I said, why? He said, well, if they were really exercising free choice, then no more than 50% would go back to their community. And I said, why is that? Well, because it should be a coin flip. They're not actually making a free choice, is what he was saying. They're not sovereign free choosers because their whole lives have been shaped by this worldview which doesn't leave them in a state of nature. So what Mill is saying, and this is really Mill's point, and the point of my former colleague at Princeton was Mill's point. So many of us, even if we theoretically have these rights, even if theoretically we can do what we want, most people, certainly at that time, are raised in very thick communities with very thick belief systems and traditions and customs. And while you can push back against impositions on your freedom from the state, you can see it, it's much more difficult to discern and detect what you've been raised in as a form of despotism that impinges on my genuine freedom. Would I, in my sovereign chooser state, be a Catholic? Or is it just the fact that I was raised this way and I went through all the training and the catechism and the nun slapped my hand, and so I'm a Catholic today? And was there ever a moment where I was free? And so what Mill's argument is really what you have to do to really make a free society is weaken to the point of almost elimination those ways of life. You have to overthrow the despotism of custom, which now isn't just political, it's social, it's familial, it's everywhere. Now, what does that take? Well, you can do that through a lot of ways. You can do it culturally. You can sort of make fun of religious people, turn them into objects of mockery. You could actually use legislation to start to impinge upon their traditionalism. You can do lots of things, and that's arguably what's happened, certainly in America over the last 50, 60 years. That religion has been massively weakened, and traditional ways of life have been massively weakened in the name of genuine freedom. So this is the import of Mill's argument, that what today we think of as progressive liberalism comes right out of Mill's argument for classical liberalism, that you can't be genuinely free until you can make the free choice. And how do you get to that point? You have to, in a sense, be naked as a chooser, not to have anything from your past impinging on your free choice. Now, if after being naked, free choosing, we've denuded the world of all these traditions, and if you want to be traditional, then you will have done it out of free choice. But what are the odds you will do that? Now, if we look at the statistics today, the odds of any of you being religious after the age of 25 is now 50%, if you were raised religious. 50%. So my colleague has gotten his wish. It's a coin flip. It's a coin flip whether you remain under the despotism of custom or not, or perhaps a free chooser of custom. So I hope that helps clarify. Okay, good. All right. Should we? Was one more? Okay, I'll promise I'll be short.
So I wanted to relate your talk to your recent book, and specifically, it seemed like the chapter 3, which I know the students also read about the good that is common, the different kinds of liberalism, the notable absence I see in what you wrote then versus what you have now is the nihilistic third wave doesn't really show up.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you might be able to tell us a little about how you might reflect on what your book's argument is about common good conservatism, what it's ever acting against.
Yeah.
Given this third factor, which I'll just say as a progressive liberal of sorts myself, is the one I'm most concerned about.
Yeah.
And I'd just be interested to hear how you would distinguish your approach from that one. Is it clear?